there exists a particular category of power that operates entirely through absence, through the control of what others cannot see and the management of what others are not allowed to know. A form of domination so complete precisely because it refuses visibility, and because it operates through systems so mundane and bureaucratic that observers struggle to recognize it as power at all, until they discover that their reality has been completely constructed by someone they have rarely encountered and whose name they may not even clearly remember. Martin Bormann was Hitler's personal secretary and later party chancellor, a man whose position in the Nazi hierarchy appeared to be administrative and peripheral, until observers noticed that nothing reached Hitler without passing through him first, that meetings Hitler scheduled were meetings Bormann had approved, that allies who had seemed secure in their positions suddenly found themselves exiled or demoted after casual conversations with Bormann, that the Führer's attention and favour and resources flowed according to patterns that could be traced backward to decisions made silently in offices by a man almost no one outside the inner circle had ever seen or could accurately describe. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we dissect the psychology of invisible power, exploring how Martin Bormann transformed the Nazi hierarchy through comprehensive control of information and access, rather than through charisma or ideology, or the overt exercise of authority, examining the mind of a man whose power derived entirely from his mastery of bureaucratic systems, and whose greatest achievement was convincing everyone around him that they were serving Hitler's will when they were actually serving his, and recognizing in his methods an approach to domination that transcends Nazi Germany, and that remains the most dangerous and least visible form of control available to those willing to operate, without the compensation of recognition or the satisfaction of being feared and admired openly. Martin Bormann was born on June 17, 1900, in Halberstadt, Germany, into circumstances so undistinguished that it would require exceptional effort to construct any narrative of destiny or inevitable greatness around his early life. He was the son of a provincial postal official, grew up in small towns that left no particular mark on his personality or ambitions, showed no signs of the charisma or intellectual brilliance or ideological passion that had marked other rising Nazi leaders, demonstrated instead a personality characterized by emotional flatness, obsessive attention to detail, and an almost pathological need to manage and control the information and resources within his sphere of influence. After World War I, where he served without distinction or advancement, Bormann drifted through various administrative positions in Thuringia, working as a land administrator and insurance assessor, roles that revealed his peculiar talents, the ability to manage complex systems, the willingness to work hours that exhausted normal people, the capacity to remember details that others found tedious and irrelevant, the intelligence to recognize how power could be accumulated through control of information and resources, rather than through public performance or ideological fervor. He joined the Nazi Party in 1927, not because he was seized by passionate conviction, but because he recognized that a rising political movement offered opportunities for advancement through administrative competence, because the SS and later the Nazi hierarchy offered structures where his particular skills could accumulate advantage. His entry into Hitler's immediate circle came through a position as secretary to Rudolf Hess, Hitler's designated successor and deputy Führer, a position that appeared subordinate and peripheral, until Bormann recognized that being near Hitler through Hess provided access. And access was the fundamental currency of power within the Nazi leadership. He was promoted to personal secretary to Hitler in 1935, a role that seemed clerical and administrative, but that quickly revealed itself as the most strategically important position in the Nazi regime, short of being Hitler himself. Because from that position, Bormann controlled what information reached the Führer, which advisors could schedule meetings with him, which documents were placed on his desk, which reports received his attention, and which were filtered out as irrelevant or redundant. The psychological profile that emerges from Bormann's behavior and recorded interactions suggests a personality structure built entirely around the acquisition and exercise of control through systems rather than through direct confrontation or charisma, someone who experienced reality primarily through documentation and procedure and information flow rather than through personal relationships or emotional connection. His diaries and surviving papers reveal an obsessive attention to detail that extended to recording conversations with Hitler, documenting every decision and instruction, creating comprehensive records that became the official archive against which all other accounts had to be measured, essentially rewriting history through the act of documentation, because subsequent historians would have access to Bormann's records and would have to treat them as the most authoritative account of what Hitler had actually intended and decided. He weaponized bureaucracy by making himself the indispensable intermediary through which all communication between Hitler and other leadership figures flowed, by insisting that all requests and recommendations and proposals that were to reach Hitler must first be submitted through his office, where they were summarized and filtered and contextualized, according to his judgment about what would interest the Führer and what could be discarded as irrelevant or contrary to Hitler's known preferences. This filtering function gave him enormous power because it allowed him to shape Hitler's perception of reality and his understanding of what options were available and what problems required his attention, essentially constructing the informational environment within which Hitler made decisions that would then be attributed to Hitler's will, rather than to Bormann's careful manipulation of what information the Führer was allowed to access. He isolated Hitler from potential rivals and alternative sources of information and counsel by controlling his schedule, by determining which meetings the Führer would attend and which delegations would be granted access, by gradually reducing Hitler's contact with advisors whose influence he perceived as threatening, by creating administrative obstacles and scheduling complications that made it increasingly difficult for other leaders to reach Hitler directly. He undermined competitors by subtly poisoning Hitler's perception of their reliability and effectiveness, by highlighting their failures and magnifying their mistakes and passing along information about their doubts or disloyalty, by positioning himself as the one person who truly understood what Hitler wanted and who could be counted on to implement his will faithfully without deviation or independent interpretation. The violence hidden within these administrative mechanisms was comprehensive and effective, destroying careers and lives through bureaucratic exclusion and informational manipulation rather than through overt force, because once you were excluded from access to Hitler, and once Bormann controlled the narrative about your competence and reliability, your official position became meaningless, and your career began an inevitable descent into irrelevance and eventual removal. The process was silent and invisible, and appeared to be governed by administrative necessity rather than by personal vendetta, which made it far more effective than direct confrontation, because victims could not clearly identify who was responsible for their destruction, and could not mount effective resistance against mechanisms that presented themselves as merely following procedure and implementing Hitler's clear intentions. What distinguishes Bormann's exercise of power from that of other Nazi leaders is that it operated through control of access and information rather than through charisma or ideology or the ability to inspire loyalty through vision or personal magnetism. Heinrich Himmler controlled the SS and the security apparatus through building organizations and inspiring fanatical loyalty through ideology and ritual and elaborate systems of promotion and status. Hermann Göring accumulated power through charm and performance, and by building personal relationships with Hitler based on shared interests in aesthetics and military matters. Bormann accumulated power by making himself the only person who truly understood how Hitler's mind worked and what the Führer actually wanted, by positioning himself as the implementation mechanism through which Hitler's will became concrete action, by becoming so thoroughly integrated into the daily machinery of government that displacing him would have required displacing Hitler's entire administrative system. His relationship with Hitler was not based on the emotional and ideological bonds that tied other leaders to the Führer, but rather on utility and mutual need. On Hitler's dependence on Bormann to organize his day and manage his communications and implement his decisions. On Bormann's recognition that his power derived entirely from his proximity to Hitler, and that anything that threatened that proximity threatened everything he had constructed. The psychological dynamic was that of a man who had completely subordinated his own identity to the role of implementing another person's will, who experienced his own worth entirely through his usefulness to Hitler, who lived in a state of constant anxiety about any possibility of being displaced or losing access, because the psychological emptiness at his core required external structure and purpose and role to maintain any sense of self at all. The administrative mechanisms he built to control information and access became increasingly comprehensive and increasingly visible in the final years of the war, as the Nazi regime deteriorated and Hitler became more isolated and more paranoid and more dependent on Bormann to maintain order and continuity within the collapsing government. Bormann orchestrated the removal of rival power centers, eliminated alternative sources of information and advice that might have presented Hitler with perspectives that Bormann had not filtered and contextualized, consolidated the administration of the party apparatus under his own authority, and by 1945 had achieved a level of control over Hitler's daily reality that made him arguably more powerful than any other individual in the regime except Hitler himself. When Berlin fell in May 1945 and Nazi Germany collapsed into chaos and rubble, Martin Bormann disappeared, vanishing into the confusion of the final days with such completeness that his ultimate fate remains unknown to this day, spawning decades of speculation about whether he escaped to Argentina or South America, whether he died in the Soviet zone and was never identified, whether he survived the war and lived in hiding for years or decades. The mystery surrounding his disappearance became a kind of historical mirror, reflecting back what Bormann had been in life. A man so invisible and so completely absorbed into administrative systems and so lacking in any distinctive personality or appearance that even tracking his death became impossible. Even determining what had happened to him required speculation and inference rather than evidence, because he had existed so completely through his functions and his position, rather than through any permanent and identifiable presence in the world. The mythology that developed around Bormann's post-war disappearance transformed him from an invisible bureaucrat into a phantom figure, a man who might have survived because he had never been fully real during his lifetime, whose power had been so completely channeled through systems and procedures that no single individual could be identified as responsible for the mechanisms themselves. In a final irony, Bormann achieved in death a kind of visibility that had eluded him in life, becoming the subject of conspiracy theories and historical speculation, precisely because he had been so thoroughly invisible during the years when his actual power was most comprehensive and most consequential. Martin Bormann's life and career reveal truths about the nature of power and domination that extend far beyond Nazi Germany, and that remain relevant to understanding how control is maintained and how resistance becomes impossible in any hierarchical system where information flow is restricted and where access to decision makers is mediated through intermediaries with their own interests and agendas. He demonstrates that the most effective and most dangerous form of power is not the kind that announces itself through charisma or ideology or the visible exercise of authority, but rather the kind that operates silently through control of information and access, that shapes reality through the filtering and contextualization of what reaches those who make decisions, that destroys rivals without leaving evidence because the destruction occurs through administrative exclusion rather than through overt violence. The psychology that enabled Bormann's effectiveness was characterized by emotional flatness and the absence of any need for recognition or admiration, by complete satisfaction with invisible influence rather than visible power, by comfort with wielding authority through bureaucratic mechanisms rather than through personal magnetism or ideological conviction, by the willingness to work with meticulous attention to detail at tasks that others would have found tedious and unrewarding, because the accumulation of small advantages and informational advantages and procedural controls eventually coalesced into comprehensive domination of the reality within which decisions were made. The warning that Bormann's methods provide concerns the danger of invisible power concentrated in bureaucratic systems with minimal oversight, the vulnerability of hierarchies where information flows through filters controlled by individuals with their own interests, the way that comprehensive control can be achieved and maintained without requiring spectacular displays of force or charisma. Because the violence of systematic exclusion and informational manipulation operates silently and invisibly, and appears to be governed by procedures and necessity rather than by personal vendetta or ambition. The most totalitarian systems are those where everyone understands that their reality has been constructed by unseen hands, but where the architecture of control is so thoroughly embedded in daily procedures and administrative necessities that it becomes invisible and then becomes inevitable and then becomes accepted as simply how the world works. This has been Forgotten Minds. Martin Bormann vanished into history the way he lived in it. invisibly, leaving behind no clear trail, no decisive evidence, no moment of recognition where his power could be identified and rejected, because he had never existed in any form visible enough to be directly confronted, demonstrating that the most complete victories in the struggle for power accrue to those who understand that recognition and admiration are distractions from the real work of control, which happens silently in offices and through the management of information and through the meticulous creation of procedures that subordinates follow without understanding that they are implementing the will of someone they have never clearly seen. Until next time, stay vigilant.